So let's look at the induction coil again. We've got here different terminals that this little write-up is going to be about. B is the battery, C is the capacitor, and there's a spark gap across the secondary winding, and this is the make and break contact point here. This is the soft iron pole. This is the electrical schematic here. Now, let's read a brief description. Induction coil essentially operates like a big buzzer. Bzzz. So there's a buzzer. What happens is the interrupter contacts here, contacts C, are wired in series between the battery and the coil. So let's look at that again. The interrupter contacts right here are in series with the battery. So there's the primary winding coming through here, going through there. So at startup, this is all a closed loop. So as soon as that loop closes, it pulls the hammer in, opens up the contact, and then you have make and break. The contacts are closed in their resting state. When power is applied, the coil is activated, which produces a magnetic field in the metal core of the coil. The magnetic contact arm V is pulled toward the core, opening the interrupter contacts, breaking the circuit, opening and closing the circuit. Points and condensers, guys. The falling magnetic field relaxes its hold. The contacts close. The entire cycle repeats. The rising and falling magnetic field of the primary coil induces a high voltage across the secondary. Okay, so the rising and falling of the magnetic field of the primary coil induces a high voltage across the secondary. This is a very basic description of what's happening. Let's look at now another description. Let's look at the induction coil. I want to show another source here. The Electrical World and Engineer, volume 41. The induction coil, page 509, by Edmund James Ives, PhD. And this is in 1903. The induction coil, using the term in its most general sense, is one of the most important pieces of apparatus in the whole range of electrical engineering. This is, guys, the microchip of 100 years ago. This is the heart. This is the most important thing. In fact, this goes way beyond what we're doing today in the normal use of electronics. Even though we can use these at times, we don't appreciate them normally. So now I just want to, not instead of going through the whole thing like I've explained already, I want to quote here: no theory of the induction coil can, however, hope to be reliable until the influence of distributed capacity in the windings can be estimated and taken into account. Some of the phenomena of the induction coil are, in fact, directly opposed to the ordinary elementary theory by reason of the effects of the distributed capacity. So it's not really hard to understand what he's saying here, but my point is, if you don't understand this phenomena that actually contradicts conventional or ordinary elementary theory, is conventional theory today, if you don't grasp that, then you won't appreciate this. You'll say, well, let's just not explore this as a source of gain. There is a gain here, and it's not really quite understood. You can see that from these particular articles. The other one being here on the capacitor. This one is the student's textbook of electricity, magnet electricity, and he says on pages 361, the condenser. Now, back then, the capacitor, right, like I have here, was considered a condenser. We still use the word condenser in the United States and Canada when we talk about points and condenser, because that's just always been used in that context, so they didn't change it, points and capacitor. The word is still used in Germany and other places as the word condenser. The condenser then is a modification of the Leyden jar, but its functions are not clearly understood. So this was already back in the 1800s. I'm not sure the exact date of this publication. He talks about, some have said that it gives an extra current here into this system. I'll show this later on. As I connect and disconnect the condenser, there is a slight difference in the performance just by adding that condenser. Now you could say I'm putting it into resonance and so forth, but the fact is it adds something to the system, as well as the whole induction coil itself with its secondary. It not only prevents its injurious action on the contact breaker. The make and break contacts create arcing and pitting, and if you don't have suitable contact material, it will wear out. And so a lot of people today just look at the secondary aspect. A lot of people look at the condenser or capacitor as to merely prevent the wearing out of the make and break contacts, but really that's only the secondary purpose of it. And here he goes on to say, but becomes itself charged, one coating with positive and the other with negative electricity. What's interesting is how they explained, the Benitez patent, we'll look at that too, how he explains the different sides of the capacitor as the inner coatings and the outer one. The inner coatings they call positive energy, and the other one negative electricity. So they make a distinction between positive and negative electricity. I think we do well to consider what they were meaning and why they use those different terminologies, because we tend to oversimplify things today and miss the particulars that are important. And now it's interesting here, this may be a disclaimer or from these earlier statements about extra current. The condenser does not increase the quantity of electricity set in motion in the secondary wire, as may be provided by the galvanometer, but it does vastly increase its intensity, as demonstrated by the physiological effects, which are important, and the length of the spark between the terminals. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to acknowledge a gain in the system, but he does at least grant that there's an intensity increase, vastly increase its intensity. Now, you could look at that as just increasing the voltage, but we will clearly see that the total power is a gain as well. So we're done with these images here. I'll leave that one up. Oh, this was the article, I never showed this. A great discovery, perpetual electric generator and engine invented. This is the Cook system as the original paper, which I wasn't able to find the original source on that. After 36 years of toil in electrical field, D.M. Cook about ready to start a machine that will never stop. So this was in 1886. So this was 15 years after his patent. So he evidently already had something, but he wasn't giving that to the public at that point until 1886. So let's get into now the history of the induction coil briefly. So the induction coil is mainly a matter of incremental improvements on the same thing. These are all pictures of induction coils of some sort. And there's your basic diagram. So it's based upon Michael Faraday's 1831 discovery of electromagnetic induction. Now, he is not the first one to discover this. Obviously, the ancients had definitely discovered these things in ancient Egypt, and other civilizations had used these things. You can see clear pictures with light bulbs and so forth. But in modern days, 200 years ago, Faraday was the one. And then we have basically the first induction coils were by two inventors, one American electrical inventor, Charles Grafton Page. He was 1812 to 1868. So in the mid 1830s, he produced this particular system here. And they were using mercury in there as a contact, and they were later using mercury, as we'll see in a minute. And then you have the French Reverend Nicholas Callan. He was 1799 to 1864. Both of these developed their system around the same time, and at least published their stuff. Others maybe have discovered these things at the same time too, but never published. And this is different pictures of iron. This is an iron core with several transformer windings on it. So you have different kinds of interrupters here. And the first, these were different models, but they weren't commercially available. These were just their own models. And you can see again mechanical make and break contacts here. There's a bigger picture of a nicer system. You can see a hand rotation there, device. Now this is approaching more similar to what I have here. And this is the first commercially available one was in French, produced by the French, Heinrich Rumkopf, and this is somewhat similar right here. This is the one, pretty much what I have. Let's see, this particular model right here, where it slides, I have that right here, this tube that goes open and closes, and it changes, it shields the primary from the secondary, and it changes that relationship there. And so you have different models here. And this one up here you have where the spark gap can go. So you have the spark gap already in the make and break contacts, and generally you usually have a secondary spark gap like you see in this one picture, and this one too. And this is what became our ignition coils with points and condenser on the early Model T Fords and so forth. So these are some induction coils, and So essentially, this is what was used in a lot of different devices, such as this is a violet ray device here. So this is used in the same way. I'll plug it in here. So this is induction coil. You can hear the interrupter. There's an interrupter in there with the spark gap, and there's essentially two. There's an induction coil with its interrupter, and then another transformer to boost this voltage up to pretty high voltage, like 30, 100,000 volts, high frequency. While that can be used to heal many ailments, it also produces ozone, which is very bad to breathe in, very dangerous. Used in a well-ventilated area, and it also creates X-rays and other things that can cause you bad radiation damage, and we'll talk about that later on. So it was used in healing devices, the induction coil. It was used in the automobile industry. It was used in numerous experiments, and this was basically the system before AC. It was unidirectional. It was like DC in the sense it starts with DC, direct current, but then it's interrupted. So it's a disruptive discharge DC, which becomes a whole another type of energy because of the make and break contacts, and the high frequency changes everything. So it can behave a lot like AC when you're dealing with these induction coils with their primary and secondaries. You can run an AC circuit, like this is obviously an AC transformer. We use that in our battery chargers, and but we can run this unidirectional current through it in the same way and get the same results. We can produce an AC sort of output. So let's look at, move over now to the Benitez system. And what we want to do is, I think we're done with Cook. Now it's very important to see the continuation now in Benitez. I traced what I was doing back to Benitez here exactly 100 years ago, and then realized that Cook was before him, and Tesla was in between. Like I said, Tesla did not invent the induction coil. He did not discover AC himself, or even polyphase. He improved upon these systems. We can look at Tesla's diagrams here. So really, Tesla is in between Benitez, and so let's look at, where is it here? Let's go back to, oh yeah, it's already here. So one thing of interest here, here's Tesla's 1886 patent. And he's using basically like a bifilar arrangement. Caduceus coil here. This is really important in a lot of different systems, going from Capnancy and the Don Smith system, which you'll see right here. We can see the same coil arrangement right there with the secondary L2 and L3s. That's exactly the same as this arrangement here. This is nothing new. This goes back over maybe 2,500 years or so. This particular arrangement in the ancient false god of the two snakes wrapping around each other with a common point around a pole, which the half of the American medical community gets wrong, was not associated with the medical. It was the one pole with one snake wrapped around it was the medical understanding of the ancient world. And the dual snake was for another purpose. But anyway, this is what we have here is a coil. So it looks like the ancients knew this concept here electrically somehow. We don't have very much information about what they did, but here with Tesla, or actually a dynamo regulator, and he's using the center tap. But notice the direction of the wires are actually opposite. With John Smith, you can see in his pictures that it is wrapped in the same fashion. So if we look at this, this is also a caduceus coil. So you wrap it one way and then you come back down. Now you can either overlap or you can do like this system. Out that way and out that way. So Tesla, yeah, and here you can see it wrapping differently. Figure one, I guess that is differently wound. This is running in the same direction. And this is the opposite direction. So this would be just like a continuation with a center tap. Whereas this is wound this way, center tap, and then wound the opposite way around. And then this is actually partly wound and overlapped. And this is more like the Capinanci system. So, so Tesla did get involved with this, and he didn't invent it. It has to be understood that this kind of coil arrangement wasn't invented by Tesla. And he acknowledges a lot of where of all the other players. It's just, in modern times, people like to oversimplify everything, both in circuitry and in history, and just try and credit Tesla with everything, or discredit him with any possible benefits as well. So I'm taking the middle ground between that. I'm not idolizing him, and I'm not discrediting everything he had to offer. So going back then to the Tesla files, what's interesting is I just want to show one picture here, because everybody talks about Tesla. I don't need to go over the same material. I want to cover these other people. But this is just an interesting diagram here I want you to be aware of. So here's your AC, or your dynamo, with your primary and then your secondary. But notice the capacitors. First of all, there's a spark gap between there, and then there's capacitors. Notice there is no connection electrically between these capacitors. There's no jumping wire. So that's the first thing to know on all these three diagrams. But the second thing to know here is this is a clear copper bar here. This is a dead short, and yet bulbs are run between this dead short. So that's something to consider, that we're dealing with something entirely differently when we're working with high frequency, high voltage. And that's all I really want to say with Tesla. Let's go into Vanitas, like I said. And what I have here is a number of patents. I'm going to just jump through really quickly. In my convention, we went through these in great detail